So I want to give the user an option to edit a listing. So I'm going to add an icon into the first cell of the repeating group. This is going to be this little edit icon. I'm actually going to make it just a pencil, and then I'm going to make it our dark yellow color. I want it to be an 82 by 32. And it's kind of awkwardly positioned over here, so I want to take that and the text and then group them in a row. It's just currently stacked like this because the UI builder doesn't have enough space, and then I want it to be this space between. Can preview this, and we can see our button over there. When I click it, I want it to open a pop-up similar to this create listing pop-up. But actually, if we think about it, when we are editing the listing, we basically need the exact same inputs. We just need them to already be defaultly filled with whatever this listing's information is, and then maybe add a status dropdown. Since we need essentially the same listing, I'm just going to use the same listing. And I'm going to give it a type of content with the data source blank. This is what we looked at in our last video, setting the data source of it, and when this button is clicked, I want to not only show the pop-up, which is what the button create listing is doing, I also want to display data in our pop-up, and I just want to display the parent group's listing. We can look at what this workflow is doing step by step. When I click this button, it is showing the pop-up, and it's grabbing the parent group's listing, which is this rainbow drive, and it's displaying that here. We can inspect this pop-up, and we can see that indeed it has our rainbow drive as its listing. So we've made it so that this pop-up is storing whatever listing we click on. For example, this one is showing Willoughby Road now. We just need to find a way to extract that data out to pre-fill these inputs. We are going to do that with initial content. I am going to make the initial content the pop-up create listings price for the price input. Let's look at this. This one costs $1,200,000, and we see that pre-filled. Let's look at when we just click create listing. We want this whole thing to be blank. And it is, because when we click this, no content is sent to there. So this pop-up's listing is empty. So this is trying to show the initial content of the pop-up's listing, which is empty, so we don't see anything. A little bit of a roundabout explanation, but you get it. We can actually set all of these parent groups to the parent groups listing, and then we can keep pulling it down like that. This one is going to be address. This one is going to be description. For this, I'm going to have a dynamic image, which is going to grab the parent group's listings picture, and I'm going to do that for the rest. Now, one thing that we don't have when we create a listing that we want to have when we edit a listing, I'm going to just move this up above the button, is an option to change its status. For this, I want to have a drop-down. This is going to be a fixed height 48, and then I wanted to stretch the entirety of this pop-up. I'm going to give it dynamic options because I just want it to display all of the statuses in the database, and it's going to show the current options display, which is a fancy word for the name of an option set. I'm going to give it a default value, the parent group's listings status. I'm going to delete that input now. Okay, let's also make these conditionally reflect that you're editing a listing versus creating one. I'm going to say when the parent group's listing, it's referring to the pop-ups listing, is not empty. When there's some value associated with this pop-up, which is only when we click the edit button, then this text is going to become edit listing instead of create listing. Similarly, when the pop-up create listings listing is not empty, this button is going to read submit. But this button is still creating a new listing. It's not what we want, so we need to add an only when condition. We covered this in our workflow logic video, but just as a quick refresher, this workflow will only execute when the button is clicked and this condition is true. So I'm going to say only when the pop-ups listing is empty do I want to create a new listing. Otherwise, when it is not empty, I want to make changes to a thing. This is the actual action of editing something in the database. Bubble needs a reference to that, so we are going to give it the pop-up create listings listing. The listing that we send to that is the listing that we want to edit, and Bubble finds that in the database and then changes the fields accordingly. Similarly to how we set up the create a new listing, we just want to set all of these fields equal to the inputs value. This is because even if the person doesn't change the field like address, we're already preloading it with whatever is currently the listing's address. So it won't end up changing anything, and that's exactly the functionality that we want because we can't predict what input they're going to change. Done. Since the pop-up is now currently storing a listing, I just want to reset the data on the pop-up. This will just clear the listing and it'll make it ready for if someone wants to create a new listing. I also want to reset the inputs, which is essentially done by this reset data, but I'm just going to do it anyway. Before we test this out, we want to add conditional visibility to this group status because we only want it to be visible when we are editing a listing. So when the pop-ups listing is not empty, this element is visible and it is not going to be visible on page load. I do want it to collapse when hidden so there isn't this awkward gap. We can create a listing and this is looking good, almost like the status dropdown was never there. And then we can go to edit a listing. Right off the bat, we can see that all of these are preloaded and we can cancel, and that doesn't affect our listing. But then we can also change these values. For example, we can change the price and we can see that reflected. Additionally, if we were to try to edit something and then remove an address, for example, it won't let us submit because this input should not be empty, still works even when we are editing. Let's just look at it a little closer. We open this, the pop-up is shown, and then we display the parent group's listing. This pop-up is holding that listing, and then when we change something and submit it, it's first checking if the pop-up create listings listing is empty, which is false. Then it checks if it is not empty, which is true. So it hides the pop-up, makes changes to the pop-up's listing, which is what we sent it, changes it to the inputs values, and then resets all of the data.